Lenin is dead. This news struck the people like a bolt from the blue. It spread to every corner of the fertile plains of Africa and the green fields of Asia. It is true that the black or yellow people do not yet know clearly who Lenin is or where Russia is. The imperialists have deliberately kept them in ignorance. Ignorance is one of the chief mainstays of capitalism. But all of them, from the Vietnamese peasants to the hunters in the Dahomey forests, they have secretly learned that in a faraway corner of the earth, there is a nation that has succeeded in overthrowing its exploiters and is managing its own country with no need for masters or governors general. They have also heard that the country is Russia, that there are courageous people there, and that the most courageous of them all was Lenin. This alone was enough to fill them with deep admiration and warm feelings for that country and its leader. But this was not all. They also learned that the great leader, after having liberated his own people, wanted to liberate other peoples too. At first they did not believe that anywhere on earth could there exist such a man and such a program. But later, they heard, although vaguely, of the communist parties, of the organization called the Communist International, which is fighting for the exploited peoples, for all the exploited peoples, including themselves. And they learned that Lenin was the leader of that organization. And this alone was enough to make these peoples wholeheartedly respect Lenin. They look upon Lenin as their liberator. As for us, we are deeply moved by this irretrievable loss and share the common mourning of all the peoples with our brothers and sisters. But we believe that the Communist International and its branches, which include branches in colonial countries, will succeed in implementing the lessons and teachings the leader has left behind for us, to do what he advised us. Is that not the best way to show our love for him? In his lifetime, he was our father, teacher, comrade, and advisor. Nowadays, he is the bright star showing us the way to the socialist revolution. Eternal Lenin will live forever in our work. What I've just read out to you was written and published 1 week after Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, died on the 21st of January 1924. It was published in Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and authored by the eventual leader of the Vietnamese communist movement, Ho Chi Minh. In just under 12 months from this publication, Ho would return to Asia and recruit the first members of the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth Association, the precursor to the Indochinese Communist Party, which I guess we could think of as the mother to the eventual Communist Party of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge. This rather impassioned farewell to the leader of the Soviet Union gives us a glimpse into the hope for a revolutionary like Ho. It is clear that he wants to see the liberation of his people from under French colonial rule, and that perhaps Lenin's program, or more broadly, communism itself, will provide it. He is a believer in Marxist doctrine and thinks that Lenin, this bright, shining star, will show the way to socialist revolution and freedom, and that this courageous country of Russia, they've shown the possibility of overthrowing the exploiters. This program, this revolutionary blueprint, as well as some other functions of a communist state, this is what Lenin offers in that Marxist-Leninist dynamic. And we saw how it was an important ideological influence on the Khmer Rouge in the introduction to the previous episode. That episode was a basic introduction to the Marxist side of the equation. And now we're going to look at the Leninist, as well as the beginnings of communism in Indochina. Welcome back to In the Shadows of Utopia. Hello there. Okay, we are back. Now, without dating this episode too much, I do hope everyone listening is well and doing okay. My name is Lachlan Peters, and as I've sort of touched on there in the prologue, this is the second part of our introduction into communism. Naturally, this is a huge subject, but we're going to keep using that greatest hits kind of idea from the last one and tackle the way that communist ideas, promulgated by Marx and Engels, became realized in the first proper communist state, bringing theory into practice. These two episodes, although light on Cambodian history, are intended to build up that basic vocabulary of communist concepts, as well as give some context to world history that will be important in the eventual historical hurricane, those cold, dry foreign winds that will coalesce with the warm, moist weather system in Cambodia and produce this devastating result in the 70s. So we've got about 50 years to cover before we get there, and a lot of stuff to talk about. Last time out, we left the story in the wake of both the first prophets of communism having passed away, without their prediction of a world revolution having occurred. But as we've seen there in Ho Chi Minh's eulogy for Lenin, it wasn't too long before communism did make a large impact in Europe. And these ideas spread across the lands and oceans to places and people hoping for change. So that is what we are going to look at. How communism became real. What putting these ideas into practice looked like, and how this political energy will be transported into large populations. We are going to explain Lenin, Stalin, the Soviet Union, but also the early movement in Indochina, and bring Uncle Ho into this picture, which will see us return to Indochina before the outset of World War II, and doing so we will have linked up world history to Cambodia once again, and these big themes like imperialism, communism, nationalism, and soon decolonization, the Cold War. That's where it's all going to play out to devastating effect. a lot to cover in this episode, so I'll try not to prattle on too much. But just before we do get into it, I thought I'd just let everyone know that the YouTube channel now has a few pieces of actual video content, rather than just the glorified PowerPoints for the podcast episodes that I've been putting out. So, we've got a Basics of Cambodian History video, which covers the start of the Khmer Empire into the present day, and a kind of video essay that answers the question, did the Khmer Rouge really kill everyone who wore glasses? Now, both videos are great if you're looking for some content which skips ahead of the timeline that the podcast series is following, as well as provides some information in a slightly more visually appealing manner. It's a bit different to the podcast. I've also scoured the internet looking for the most interesting footage that I've been able to find of Cambodia, as well as some of those very rare glimpses that do remain of the country while it was under the Khmer Rouge. So please, if you are interested, go and check them out. The link is in the description. Also, I'd like to take this moment that now the show is on Patreon. I would like to thank the show's Patreon supporters, as well as those of you who had previously made a donation via PayPal in the past. This really helps in two ways, with the costs of running the show, as well as incentivizing me to purchase more books and resources to make the show even better going forward. So, please visit the support page on the website if you would like any more information on how you could contribute if you would like to. But enough housekeeping, let us return to the story with episode 9, Communism in Practice. On the 9th of April, 1917, at the height of the First World War, a train departed a station in Zurich. This train was going to make the week-long journey east to Petrograd, the capital of the Russian Empire. An empire that was currently shaking on its knees. Now, sat in a specially cordoned off carriage of that train were 31 revolutionaries who had until recently been living in exile. Among them, their leader, Lenin. Their position in this carriage and the intent of those who arranged for their trip back home was likened in a speech made by Winston Churchill just 2 years later as the equivalent of sending a file containing a culture of typhoid or cholera to be poured into the water supply of a great city. Okay, well, I don't think it is a bold claim to say that this train will change the course of history, not only in Europe or Russia, but for the world. I've heard it called a locomotive of history, and it is a phrase I can't help but adopt. The Germans, who were trying to eliminate their Eastern Front war with Russia in the world's first total war, were counting on the revolutionaries that they'd put aboard this train to further destabilize a Russian government in chaos. This war had taken a severe toll on the Russian army and the Russian people. Casualties were in the millions, and defeats against Germany and her allies had mounted. By 1917, riots had broken out that led to the abdication of one of the oldest monarchies in Europe, one of the most backward and conservative, if we recall how Marx and Engels had bemoaned the existence of the Russian Empire. The Tsar had left, and the provisional government that had replaced him was weak. On April 6th of that year, just a few days earlier, the United States had announced its entry into the war against Germany, and time was running out for the Central European power as it clung on to fight on the Western Front with Britain and France. A possible solution presented itself as Russia looked on the verge of collapse. If we could get them out of the fight, and then make one last push to the west before the Americans arrived to inevitably turn the tide. So they bundled up these exiles, these agitators, like Lenin, cordoned off their carriage, and sent them home. Almost as if they literally were some kind of virus that needed to be locked in to a specific compartment. And few could have predicted at this time just how deeply this would eventually affect events in the years and decades to come. So, who was this agitator on the train? And how is it that Russia will become the seat of this communist revolution? Hadn't Marx and Engels said that it would be like one of the least hospitable locations for their predictions to come true? Well, Lenin was a committed revolutionary and a devotee of Marxism. At this point in 1917, he had been living as an exile in Switzerland for more than 10 years. Again, it seems communism and living in exile go hand in hand, don't they? Anyway, Lenin had become the most prominent leader in one faction of the Russian Marxist movement after the turn of the century. The theories of Marx and Engels had been circulating in the old Russian Empire since around the time that Das Kapital was published in the 1860s. These ideas became more popular for the burgeoning class of intellectuals in Russia throughout the 1880s, where they were considered to be this fine critique of capitalism and the crippling effect it was having on the industrial working class. Now, at this time, Russia did not have a particularly large amount of this class, but still. Now, remember, this class we're talking about, the factory workers, or proletariat in Marxist parlance, were supposed to be the foundation of the socialist and eventual communist revolution. It was their historical role that was largely going to be fulfilled. And you needed industrialization to increase the size of that class exponentially before that revolution could begin. Right? Well, that scheme presented quite the problem for these Russian intellectuals. As we explained in the end of the last episode, Russia was almost unique in Europe at this time for its backwardness, its predominantly agrarian economy. I mean, it was still essentially basically an ancien regime, like pre-revolutionary France. It was run by a Tsar who essentially ruled through divine right, and a combination of the massive territory as well as diverse group of ethnicities within its borders. Well, this kind of produced a need for an exercise of rule that was rather authoritarian and repressive. Groups or individuals living in this old Russian Empire who were thought to be subversive or potentially problematic were hunted down and sent into exile to Siberia, imprisoned or simply murdered. This led to a culture of secrecy, the need to form discrete cells of organizations that could work in the shadows, work in hiding to achieve their goals. This Russian culture of secrecy and hiding will be adopted by the Russian Marxists as well, and eventually revolutionaries around the world will emulate this kind of underground movement. It requires a tough and hard individual who is dedicated to the cause. And the realities of this lifestyle will kind of require those that are participating in it to engage in a kind of ideological strengthening, an ideological workout regime. This would involve a tradition of debate and self-criticism, showcasing just how fully you could grasp the concepts of the revolution and your ideological toughness. This almost ritualistic practice was known as Kritika, and it is probably a kind of cultural transplant from Russian Orthodox Christianity, but instead you're confessing to ideological mistakes, or instances where you weren't being the best revolutionary you could be. Both this culture of secrecy and this practice of self-criticism will be adopted later by the Khmer Rouge. But for these Russian Marxists, well, you can see how they were presented with a bit of a problem going forward. As the theory of Marx predicted, a hefty amount of patience would be required for history to catch up in Russia to the state it was in the more so-called developed West of Europe or the United States. Remember, capitalism was the penultimate stage of history, and for the conservative Russian Empire to develop into a socialist society, well, I guess you'd need to wait for the Tsar to be toppled, a middle-class dominated democracy to then follow that, and then eventually I guess you'd get industrialization and then capitalism, and that would create the kind of class struggle necessary for the communist revolution, right? That was just how history worked, according to Marxism. Well, for Lenin and his faction of the Russian Marxist movement, known as the Bolsheviks, there would have to be another way, another path for Russia to communism, and a blueprint for others to follow. And they just needed the right time to put this plan into motion. A kind of dress rehearsal for Lenin will occur in 1905, and it will function in a similar way, if you'll remember, to the way that Marx had reacted to the 1848 revolutions, and particularly the one that occurred in his native Germany. Serious missteps in Tsarist policies, including a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, will showcase just how broken many facets of the Russian Empire had become by this stage. The unrest that followed around the empire led to the near collapse of the government. However, Lenin would arrive just too late to affect the events. The Tsar he introduced enough reform to keep the empire on its feet, and the people didn't have to resort to complete revolt. While Lenin, defeated I guess you could say, returned to Switzerland to strengthen his theories further and wait for another opportunity to pounce. Now, part of the reforms of the Russian government included creating a weak legislature, known as the Duma, and they also introduced some basic civil liberties, like the right of assembly. At this point, some workers began forming these kinds of councils, I guess you could say, and this was done in most major cities. Now, these workers' councils were known as Soviets. Between 1905 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the Russian Empire would actually make some impressive steps toward industrialization, and an industrial working class would develop accordingly. However, the system was far from what Marx would consider capitalism, and the country remained dominated by the rural agricultural economy. So that's just kind of the state of the Russian Empire. And it's certainly not brimming with, the revolutionary fervor of a massive proletariat class that have realized their historical position. And it's at this point that we can kind of identify Lenin's blueprint, his path to socialism for Russia. Basically, what can you do if you don't wish to wait for history? How can you give it a nudge? Or, for that matter, how can you drag a mass of people into history? Well, for Lenin, you did not need to wait for an entire proletariat class to develop, nor wait for capitalism to force them into realizing their position in history. All you really needed was a small group, an elite group, of sufficiently dedicated and ideologically motivated individuals to lead the rest forward. Lenin is going to introduce the idea of a revolutionary vanguard into the communist gospel. Now, a vanguard is the troops at the very tip of an advancing army, the tip of the spear, so to speak. And this tip of the spear could guide a revolution and a society into socialism and communism. This would create a kind of shortcut through history. Skip a couple of chapters to the end of the movie. This small group of elite revolutionaries will be able to induce the end of history. And this is the point I really want to linger on, because it's not so much the minutiae of events occurring in Russia in the coming revolution, and it's the development of these ideas, these political structures that will endure, that come out of these ideas. Communism, if we think of it as a kind of religion, well, it has a few central tenets, but it doesn't have a sacred, strict, or unchanging Bible. Even while Marx was alive, these ideas were amorphous and subject to debate or change. And Lenin, coming up with the concept of a revolutionary vanguard, proclaims a new testament, and he is bringing it with him on the locomotive of history. Now, when you hear the phrase Russian Revolution, generally you might think of the one that occurs in October, the so-called Red October Revolution. But there are actually two that occur in 1917, and the first one occurs in a kind of spontaneous fashion, as the pretty awful conditions of the First World War became so unbearable that the Russian population cracks, and we see the revolts that will lead to the Tsar's abdication. The government that forms in his absence, out of that previously established weak legislature, the Duma, well, they begin to maintain control again, but it's on uncertain territory. And they also decide to keep the war going with Germany, despite the state of this now severely rattled Russian Empire and army. This is when that German effort to introduce Lenin and other revolutionaries into this equation starts to begin, hoping that this will remove Russia from the conflict they were still fighting in. And Lenin arrives to a packed train station in Petrograd. They're eagerly awaiting him. The message that Lenin spread when he gets off this train to this cheering crowd of devotees, well, he condemned this provisional government. He demanded an end to the war, and he demanded land for the poor as well. So this will kind of be distilled into a pretty simple and effective cry for peace, land, and bread. This appealed to soldiers who wanted the war to be over, workers who needed food, and the peasants in the countryside demanding land from their landlords. In Russia, in 1917, Lenin will make the case, within a Marxist frame of history, that the conditions imposed on the people were a deplorable result of an imperialist war, meaning that the war itself is a result of, this class struggle, the capitalism failing, etc. So, therefore, the massive amount of casualties, the intensive labour required to keep the war effort alive, and the threat of major famine in the cities, well, all of that is a result of imperialism, capitalism, and this also created the perfect conditions for a revolution, or for his proletarian vanguard to at least lead one. Lenin, on the eve of the October Revolution, writes in something he wrote called The State and Revolution, quote, "The imperialist war has immensely accelerated and intensified the process of transformation of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism. The monstrous oppression of the working people by the state, which is merging more and more with the all-powerful capitalist associations, is becoming increasingly worse. The advanced countries, we mean their hinterland, are becoming military convict prisons for the workers. The unprecedented horrors and miseries of the protracted war are making the people's position unbearable and increasing their anger. The world proletarian revolution is clearly maturing." End quote. So I realise the language there is a little bit meaty, but he's essentially just making that point I was trying to get across, that the First World War is a result of capitalism, so ergo the class struggle that occurs from it can be fit into this Marxist view of history. So this German plan to infect Russia, as Churchill would put it, did not take long to mature. From the February revolutions that toppled the Tsarist regime, to the arrival of radicals like Lenin and Trotsky, well, it's just going to take about 7 months for Lenin and his Bolshevik party to seize power. 7 months for Lenin to attract support for his faction, for the Bolsheviks to unite the Congress of Russian Soviets, all those workers' councils, and storm the Winter Palace, the old residence of the Russian emperors. October 25th would see Lenin, a man who lived for revolution, take charge. The Second Russian Revolution began. Now, if you remember a couple of episodes back, I began trying to sketch out this idea of nationalism as a kind of energy, a political energy, one that can be compared to a fire. This fire is almost naturally occurring in some people, and some seem to have more, and some people barely any at all. This political energy can be harnessed by individuals, groups, or governments in different ways. Sometimes it needs to be created as well, as we saw during the French Revolution, or Cambodia in the 1930s. You don't need many ingredients to get it going. A newspaper, or sometimes a stirring national anthem, might be enough. And we've also seen how using this energy, well, in the extreme, it can have some pretty dark consequences. Now, what I want to introduce in this episode is a different kind of political energy, or at least a different way of making and harnessing political energy within a given population. And forgive me if I am pushing the metaphor to its limits here, but if nationalism is this kind of rudimentary coal, fire, steam engine kind of thing, well, I want to think of communism as something more complex, like a nuclear reactor. Without getting into the engineering or the physics here, I think we can all vaguely imagine the intricacies and technological prowess that is required to set up that kind of power station, as opposed to just, digging up some coal and shoveling it onto a fire. This is what the communists were dealing with. Marx and Engels had kind of split the atom. They'd done the math and, according to them, had figured out what history really was. But it's going to be Lenin who actually draws up the plans to build the reactor. Build a state founded on communist values rather than nationalist ones. And let's face it, there is a reason why nationalism tends to be able to get a pretty good handle on some people. A song about another country coming to take your land and kill your sons and daughters might just be enough to convince some people that their country is better than anyone else's, and if you want them to go to war for that, well, there's a significant amount of people that are probably going to be into that. Whereas setting up communism, getting that spark alight and keeping it from going out, I feel like that's a different story. Particularly in a country that was apparently nowhere near getting there on its own, according to the grand historical predictions. This is what Lenin and the Bolsheviks are faced with. They are the proletarian vanguard, and they must set up a system that can produce this energy not only on the working class, where it's supposed to be easy for them to just get it, but they've also got to do this in huge amounts within the agrarian peasantry in Russia, but with also everyone else who might not feel like being a communist, or in fact particularly agree with these ideas about class struggle or capitalism. And this, I think, is an interesting point to remember in a series where we're going to deal with a few more communist revolutions before we get to the Khmer Rouge, is that, I guess, the idea of communism in theory, well, it really gets pushed on these populations in a way that doesn't really match up with how it's supposed to come along in those early Marxist formulations. It's usually a means to a different end. For Ho Chi Minh, it seems that communism becomes an avenue for nationalist rebellion against the French. It's a means to getting his people away from colonialism, rather than this standard Marxist, I guess you could say, orthodox idea that a working class will simply realize its position and topple those that are oppressing it. And this is a point that I think some people will regularly bring up. They'll say that, efforts to create communism in the 20th century, well, they weren't really communist, they always had these other things going on, and it might be a fair enough point, but the point I'm trying to make is that there is a political energy that must be created in a population. If your goal is to create this fundamentally different society, this communist society, you have to set things up in a certain way to make that work for you. And I think that introduces many problems within a society, and perhaps some fairly oppressive regimes. The Soviet Union will be an example, as will Mao's China, and the focus of this series, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So feelings about, true socialism or efforts to create communism aside, this is more a study of what happens when you might try and do that in a particular country or society. Now, if the proletarian consciousness, if that is going to be projected onto an entire Russian Empire, well, the apparatus that must be built to facilitate and then sustain this political energy, that structure will need to be immense. To achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Bolsheviks may have to resort to some fairly extreme measures. Okay, so the Bolsheviks have taken power. What next? Well, they move quickly to cement their position. And if we keep up this power station metaphor, well, they look around and see if there are any other rival sources of energy out there and shut them down. The most obvious source is the former royal family, and the Bolsheviks murdered the imprisoned Tsar Nicholas II and his family, shooting them in a cellar in Ekaterinburg in July 1918, just as the Jacobins had executed Louis XVI in France. Lenin's conception of how a communist revolution would survive was based on the centralization of leadership, and this was in part due to the perception that other groups or forces would oppose his revolution. This is why at first the other socialist parties were purged. But there were bigger elements to defeat. Parts of the old Russian military, reluctant national groups in non-Russian parts of the empire, as well as international enemies. The failed Paris Commune was a part of socialist folklore, and the perception that it had failed because it didn't have a strong enough central leadership, or that it was betrayed by oppositional classes which were part of the revolution. Well, this was a lesson that Lenin had taken seriously. He famously counted down the days that the Russian Revolution had lasted in comparison to the 72 days that the Paris Commune had held. While fighting to secure their revolution, Lenin and his followers from early 1918 pursued four main goals: the seizure of land by the agrarian peasantry, the seizure of factories by the workers, an immediate peace, and the export of international communism. We will return to that last one a bit later. Okay, so nominally the Soviet Republic was run by the representative Soviet Council or government, but in reality all of that power was really just vested in the Bolshevik Party Central Committee, with Lenin at the head of this Central Committee, a term we will become increasingly used to. So, how did they start trying to achieve these four main goals? What are the functions of this new system? Firstly, land. Lenin had figured that because of Russia's special circumstances, his proletarian vanguard would need to be able to, at least temporarily, get the rural peasantry on board with their plans. So to do that, you give them the land they worked on, and then you would be able to use the produce they made to feed your working class in the city. This satisfies the bread and the land, part of the Bolshevik rallying cry which had got them this far. Getting this land from the previous landed nobility, remember Russia was in many ways still functioning in a very old-fashioned way. Well, this seizure, encouraged by the communists, was a way for peasants to also engage in class warfare. Private ownership of land was actually abolished in February 1918, and Lenin was kind of keen to abolish money as well, but some of his entourage discouraged that part of the plan. The Bolsheviks did move rapidly to seize banks, however, and doing so allowed them to gradually take control of money in this new Soviet republic. Controlling the banks effectively meant that any remaining industry in Russia that wasn't immediately nationalized was still under the control of the communists. The results of these early attempts to instill this communist political energy, this vanguard leading the revolution forward, well, they weren't great. Lenin's so-called war communism, like this land reform and collectivization, well, it led to peasant revolts and starvation, as the old food distribution system was disrupted. Communist representatives of the government were often faced with surly peasants when arriving to requisition the food that they had grown to be able to distribute this to soldiers and workers back in the cities. And the changes economically, well, they're not going that smooth either. For instance, the workers that were put in charge of factories, well, they often lacked the appropriate experience to do so. The Bolsheviks did make good on their promise to get Russia out of World War I, though. The infamous Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would eventually be signed in March 1918, and it was not kind to the Soviets. This was a bad deal. The old Russian Empire lost a fourth of its territory as Germany rallied its eastern forces and attempted to break the deadlock back on the Western Front. In one lecture I was listening to, I remember he said that when Lenin was, shown this treaty, he says, well, yeah, whatever, sign it. It's not like we're going to, honor it. The communist revolution is going to occur soon. It would, in the end, for the Germans, not prove enough, and the US arrival would bolster the Allied forces, and eventually Germany, too, would surrender. The Great War ending in November of 1918. But war was not over in the new Soviet Republic. The communist seizure of power would lead to a civil war in that region. A war that will, in a small part, begin to sow the seeds of mistrust between the new communist Soviet Union and the big powers of the world, these capitalist, in their eyes, imperialist powers. These powers included Russia's former allies, like Britain, France, and now the United States. And these countries were afraid of further communist revolution. Now, remember that part of Lenin's grand plan here is that this new Soviet system, well, that's going to be a spark for worldwide communism. And kind of like how we saw within the French Revolution, there are going to be big powers outside of, as well as inside of this new revolutionary state that are gonna basically prefer that it didn't continue, or certainly didn't spread. Russia's former allies blockaded this new Soviet Republic, exacerbating the food crisis that was going on, but they also directly supported an ununified kind of array of former Russian generals or former Austro-Hungarian armed forces. This encouraged Lenin to form the Red Army and launch what is known as the Red Terror, where thousands of opposition figures were executed. The Russian Civil War extracted a very high price, more so in the context of the losses that had already occurred from the First World War. Perhaps more than 9 million people died in this turmoil. That number comprised of those who were either killed or died of starvation or disease. Foreign intervention in this manner also allowed the Bolsheviks to portray themselves as socialist patriots in opposition to these other world powers. It also reinforced Lenin's ideas that these imperialist foreign powers, well, they were going to seek an end for his communist revolution. These early configurations of East versus West will last long in the memory of those leading the Soviet Union. And for me, this will set the very early groundwork for the conflict that will become the Cold War at the end of World War II. In fact, at the end of the First World War, prominent French socialist Albert Thomas announced in a newspaper article that the world would have to decide between either Lenin or American President Woodrow Wilson. This kind of foreshadows the Cold War dynamic that is going to force the world into communism or capitalism for most of the remaining century. So, the locomotive of history reached its destination, and the Bolsheviks began dragging the Russian Empire along to the point that they believed history was going to end. But, as we can all probably tell, it did not. The early goal of keeping the Russian Soviet Revolution alive long enough for all of the other European powers to have their own communist revolutions wouldn't exactly go to plan. As the Soviets waged war on the parts of the Russian Empire that were still reluctant to join them, the rest of the world tried to make sense of the utter human tragedy that the First World War had presented them with. This was almost like an existential crisis for all of the people of the world who had thought they were so capable, so advanced, and so cherished in God's eyes that they deserved to inherit the world. And now they had wasted millions of their own in a kind of meat grinder on the fields of France and beyond. The aftermath of World War I is an easily discernible mark on the core sample of human history. A black mark which seems to bleed into what followed for decades, and perhaps all the way into the modern day. The First World War gave cover to the first modern genocide, the Young Turk government of the Ottoman Empire having attempted to exterminate the majority of their Armenian subjects. The Treaty of Versailles, drawn up by the victorious and damaged British and French, forcing Germany to admit the guilt for the war and become subject to extreme claims for compensation. Conditions that will, in part, give Adolf Hitler a big enough platform to succeed in politics. Efforts toward economic recovery and a smooth process of demilitarization are complicated by the outbreak of the worst pandemic in history, the Spanish flu, which claims millions more lives. Different economic factors were producing recovery in the short term, but then perhaps moving toward an eventual collapse, and the Great Depression would approach in the early 1930s. This is a crucial era in world history, between the world wars, and that initial impact of the First World War cannot be understated. Society was affected as well. For instance, women had grown into new roles that were required of them during total war, and their status was not going back in a hurry. Faith in God or government was severely shaken by the utter devastation of the conflict. Art changed. Poetry. The United States, creditor for both France and Britain, came out of the war looking better than it had going in. While not yet the world's superpower, the course was being set out. All the big themes of history in the 20th century are more or less in play by this point. Fascism will rise in parts of Europe, as will the influence of the Soviet Union. The modern processes of imperialism, colonialism, the things we've looked at in previous episodes, well, they've kind of reached their zenith by this point, and they will begin to recede. And efforts for smaller nations to govern themselves will become more prominent. The circumstances that will quickly lead to the Second World War, and then following that, the Cold War, well, all of this is less than 20 years away. But if we were going to return to the more limited scope of this series, we will look back to the state and apparatus that Lenin and the Bolsheviks are beginning to build in what they are soon going to officially announce as the Soviet Union. And once we've essentially established what the Soviet Union is, we will be able to follow a thread back to Indochina, follow these cold, dry winds as they begin to arrive in the region. Okay, so as I kind of alluded to just previously, in the aftermath of World War I, this new Soviet communist experiment that was led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks was still very much in the process of fighting a civil war, and essentially clearing out any opposition to what was going to be a rather radical departure from the status quo in that part of the world. Once they had survived long enough to make it official, the Bolsheviks declared the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, or the USSR, as we will call it from here on out. This was on the 30th of December, 1922. Now, if we recall some of the predictions of Marx and Engels at the heart of this whole venture, wasn't the state supposed to wither away as the workers' paradise became a reality? Wasn't politics supposed to basically stop? Well, the declaration of the Soviet Union is kind of an acceptance that they were going to have to be at this for a while longer. This creates a vision of the Soviet Union as a kind of shining beacon, one that will need to withstand the forces of capitalism and imperialism until history, inevitably, brings the class struggle to its conclusion. It is just a little bit like those common notions of the United States as this kind of exceptional land of the free, one that will serve as an example to the world for liberal democracies. And again, you can start to see how this bipolar dynamic is forming its roots. But we will get there soon enough. For now, let's look at the functions of this state, as the Bolsheviks begin to cement their power and basically create a whole new kind of civilization. As we spoke about just before, the four main goals of Lenin in the initial period of revolution were giving land to the peasants, getting the factories under their control, and figuring out a way out of the First World War, in what I feel is fairly reminiscent of the French Revolution. Again, another new society in formation with, some pretty big ideas behind it, but figuring out how to make it stick in an actual population. Well, just like the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks meet their initial challenges with terror. The vanguard of revolutionaries would need to enforce their proletarian consciousness on this population, and violence was seen as a legitimate tool of statecraft and a response to this resistance. Initially, a multi-party government, meaning that there were representatives from different socialist factions. The Bolsheviks were there, yes, but so were the Mensheviks and other revolutionary socialists. But by the end of 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, increasingly calling themselves just communists, used the excuse that the revolution was threatened by counter-revolutionaries, and they began seizing control of the whole operation. Rather quickly, these other factions were purged from the leadership, and the state, rather than withering away as predicted, was simply reorganized. Factories and land were taken over by the communists, and a new secret police force, the Cheka, were charged with defending the revolution. This force would eventually become the NKVD and the KGB. Officers of the Cheka were feared and recognizable. They wore these long black leather coats and they carried large pistols. Their headquarters, a big building that was formerly an insurance business, was a maze of long corridors, secret cells, and torture chambers, as enemies of the revolution would soon find out. The beginnings of what is essentially a concentration camp system were established to imprison political rivals and those deemed enemies of the state. The start of the Gulag system. Essentially, any rival to the Bolsheviks was suppressed. Newspapers were also banned. There is naturally going to be a number of challenges in setting up any kind of new political system, and for this one, well, they were met with what Lenin called war communism. Remember, Marx and Engels didn't exactly leave behind a really detailed step-by-step guide to setting up a communist state, and the conditions in Russia, including the fallout from the First World War as well as the Civil War that followed, well, they weren't exactly great. This huge effort to bring socialism into existence straight away, or essentially forcing everyone along into this new apparatus to produce this communist political energy, it wasn't going very smoothly. There were some big early crises. There are some revolts against Soviet rule that required the Red Army to crush these isolated areas of rebellion, and there is also a massive famine in the Volga region just southwest of Moscow. This kills millions, and although it may not be exclusively the result of war communism and the party, requisitioning food from the farmers, it may be that this did exacerbate the problem to some extent. Faced with a few of these pretty serious issues, again, this Volga famine is a really big human disaster. Well, Lenin and the Bolsheviks are put in a position where they need to reconsider some of their policies. War communism needed to be backpedaled just a bit, and this came under the banner of the New Economic Policy, or NEP for short. This was aimed at giving the Bolsheviks a bit of breathing space, and it reintroduced a limited market economy in some territories, to encourage more food production rather than just expecting farmers to grow and then give up their produce without any incentive. It was essentially an admission that things needed to be slowed down a little bit. Perhaps full socialism could be attained in a more gradual fashion. Now, let's pop a little flag down there for now, because I don't want to get too bogged down in policies here, but rather keep it a bit more focused on the ideas themselves that are being brewed up here and toyed with. This backing away from an attempt at getting straight to socialism is important, because it first of all highlights the way in which this new kind of communist political energy and the apparatus of the state that needs to be set up to get it all going, well, it's tough. Asking people to work very hard for very little in return and getting them to buy into this vision of the proletarian vanguard, it's not so easy. Now, while war communism itself is being stepped back from a little bit with this NEP, the New Economic Policy, it is also accompanied by a tightening of ideological control within the party itself. Lenin, in 1921, declared that the party was not a debating society in which all opinions are tolerated and freely expressed. It was a vanguard party whose role as leader of the revolution demanded extreme discipline and a high level of organization. So, in order to act decisively and effectively, once a decision was made on a course of action, further discussion and dissent was over. Well, what does that mean? Well, debate within the party was outlawed once the anti-factionalism rule was passed, meaning that an extremely narrow party line or path would be established, and then all dissent and questioning of this was considered oppositional. This is fascinating too, because it is one of those elastic kind of rules. Like, it's not perfectly clear when it's no longer okay to question a decision. When do you go from debating and coming up with ideas to straight up crossing the line? A line which, once crossed, could have some fairly serious consequences, comrade. This general system of a small party centre, who would decide on a course of action, and then every other mechanism of the state would follow that directive without question, will become known as democratic centralism, and it will be included in the Communist Party of Cambodia's organisational structure. And the treatment of those within the party that are seen to be dissenting from the party line or path will also be similarly frowned upon, to put it lightly. So we're getting a picture here of a highly centralized leadership that, they'll have some discussions about what they're going to do next, but once that's decided, that's it. And at the moment, they've decided to step back just a tad from this war communism. And this is going to have consequences too, which we'll see just in a bit. But I am painting a picture of a fairly authoritarian regime, and I think it's pretty fair to say that it was. But it should also be said that, on the whole, sometimes this period in the very early 20s is actually looked upon in a rather hopeful manner. The world was witnessing a new radical civilization grow, and perhaps the means would justify the ends, and attempts to engineer this pure proletarian culture would push this Soviet society toward a utopian future. The blueprints that Lenin had come up with, based on the theories of Marx and Engels, well, he and his Vanguard had built this radical new political energy generator, and it was up and running, even if it was reliant on the threat of force to ensure loyalty, propaganda to convince the people of its legitimacy, and monitoring the public to make sure they were sustaining the apparatus of the state. This metaphorical power station spread into every home and every mind, and it had to do so to keep it running. And just as it began to form this totalitarian structure, something happens in the core. There is a change in the proletarian vanguard, the very tip of the spear. Lenin has a stroke, the first of 7, that will slowly degrade him physically and eventually incapacitate him. He loses his ability to speak, and in his final months, he was full of doubt about the future of the Soviet leadership. He dies in 1924, and there will be a new person in the very core of this power station, at the tip of the proletarian vanguard. A man named Joseph Stalin. Now, again, I am not as concerned with the precise details and going through Soviet history step by step here, as I am with just bringing to the foreground some of the ideas that come out of this period of history. And in the spirit of the greatest hits that this introduction to communism was intended to function as, I believe Iron Maiden was brought up as the example of that huge band where picking 15 or 20 songs out of 100 or so would be quite hard to do. Well, Stalin is an essential part of that track list. We need to talk about command economies, or these 5-year plans, as I'm sure you're aware of the term, the elimination of class enemies, and the terror of internal purges. All of these are essential in building up the vocabulary we need for discussing the Khmer Rouge Revolution. and the means that justify the ends of these idealized utopian communist societies. So firstly, let's start with, as I said, one of these really common phrases that comes along with, talking about Stalin's Soviet Union. The 5-year plan. Okay, so part of what Stalin called the Second October Revolution, well, this was announced at a party congress in 1928. Party congress too, that's a kind of communist word that I think eventually for us, over the course of this series, will become second nature. The party members all convene to decide on certain things and discuss certain issues. In this case, Stalin announced what would essentially be the complete transformation of the Soviet economy. If Lenin's new economic policy in the early 20s had been an attempt at scaling back war communism in order to facilitate a more gradual process towards socialism, well, Stalin was abandoning that. If history had leapt forward in 1917 with the revolution in Petrograd, Stalin said that this new policy represented another great leap in history, a phrase that will be borrowed by Mao and then again by the Khmer Rouge. Stalin was, by all accounts I've read, an arsehole. He was rough, crude, and mean, but he was also a highly skilled politician and a mastermind of calibrating his image in public. He seized on the term 5-year plan as this kind of catch-all slogan for his new economic policy, a policy that was extremely ambitious. This gives us our first glimpse at the centralized command economy. It was supposed to be a long and comprehensive plan to transition to socialism. The party worked out targets that had to be met in those 5 years. Big targets. Huge. We're talking like if your boss came to you and said, hey, the amount of work you did last year, well, can you do 3 times as much this year? Okay, thank you. And, in Soviet Union terms, it was decided that the entire industry, that is the industry of the Soviet Union, should increase by 250%. A staggering increase, almost a ridiculous target. Within that wider goal, you've got really specific targets too, like pig iron production is to triple, or electrical power generation is to be quadrupled. The entire economy would need to make a quantum leap to produce this. This shows us what could be termed Stalinism as well. Like there is some belief behind him in these schemes. As we've said before, there is a propaganda machine at work here in the background, and you can sense the energy that was being produced by this communism machine. The structure of the Soviet state was paying dividends. And for any particular worker that perhaps wasn't feeling this energy as much as someone else, in the same way that someone might not get as nationalistic as his neighbor, well, in Stalin's Soviet Union, reluctance to engage in this economic warfare, a lack of this political energy, this revolutionary zeal, the proletarian consciousness we've been harping on about, well, that could always be fixed by the rather coercive arm of the state pushing you toward the aims of the party. Whether you believed in the theories of Marx or Engels, or if you'd even heard of them, fear is a terrific motivator in most people. One lecture I was listening to about this part of Soviet history deemed some of these projects to be pharaonic in what they were demanding. One of them, the White Sea Canal, was an attempt to join the White Sea and the Baltic Sea. Just a few 100 kilometers of canal. No biggie. Somewhere around 200,000 workers were sent to work on this project in the frozen north, breaking rocks with axes and picks, carrying the rocks. driven by a mixture of communist energy and the coercive power of the party. Maybe some 20,000 people died working on this canal. One which, in the end, would not be dug deep enough and therefore not be commercially viable. But all of this, building new factories, even factory cities, more railroads, more roads, all of this is part of the 5-year plan, focused on what is essentially creating a dominant heavy industry. And if we're talking about ends justifying means, well, the Soviet Union does end up with a big heavy industry toward the end of this process. And the heavy industry thing kind of works. The other part of that plan involved the transformation of agriculture, mostly through the idea of completely collectivizing the largest part of the Soviet economy. The 5-year plan had a goal of creating enormous rural collective farms, and I heard this explained in a really interesting way. Collectivizing farming like this was in essence trying to treat a farm like a factory. Instead of one family owning a farm and working it over the season with their tools and their farm animals, gathering the produce and selling it at market, well, now no one would own the farms, and instead the workers would come to the land and work as if they were coming to work at a factory. The state owned everything and the products that came from it. These workers, instead of going to the city, to the industrial factories there, well, rather they were collected and put to work in the farming factories in the countryside. Traditional farmers were forced to give up their tools of the trade, as these now belonged to the collective. Stalin also announced that the liquidation of a particular class of the rural peasantry would be necessary in order for this collectivization to be successful. The term liquidated is less about turning people into soup and more a Russian term that roughly equates with eliminate. So the liquidators, the ones that worked on the Chernobyl disaster cleanup, you could see that they were eliminating the kinds of fallout produced by the reactor explosion. So when Stalin says that this class of supposedly wealthy peasants, known as the kulaks, were to be liquidated, he is talking about eliminating this class from Soviet society. Now, this term kulak, it's very elastic, and it is kind of hard to come down on a hard definition of this class of people. And for this series, it may be simpler if we just say the kulaks were kind of whoever the Soviet state wanted them to be. In fact, some members of this class may have attained that status through some of the changes that came from Lenin's new economic policy. This was a class that were counter to the aims of the Bolsheviks. They were what Robespierre would have termed as counter-revolutionaries. The secret police would decide on who would be shot or imprisoned, sent to the Gulag in Siberia, or those to simply be evicted and used in forced labor colonies. This process, called de-kulakization, is the Soviet state identifying enemies of the revolution, those hindering the spread of communist energy due to their bourgeoisie tendencies. But Stalin could also include other groups into this, like rabbis, those with connections to any former peasant rebellions, or remnants of those who fought against the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. There were enemies out there that they could target. This identification of class enemies is something that we will spend a lot of time on later in this series. But collectivization did not only mean the liquidation of the kulaks, but it was also responsible, that is, the state that designed this economic policy, for massive amounts of famine. The so-called Holodomor, or the terror famine that occurred in the Ukraine as a result of these policies, well, there is a very large and important discussion that is outside of the scope of this series, but it is very interesting in its historical debate about the culpability of someone like Stalin in what has been argued to be genocide. Whether or not that term is completely applicable to that case is irrelevant to the reality of the suffering that occurred in the Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. Starvation was so severe that cannibalism was, and I use the term in a considered way, widespread. Estimates vary considerably, but somewhere around 3 million people died. Whether this was all down to Soviet policy or even an actual attempt at creating famine conditions, well, this is, as I said, still a matter of debate between historians. The first 5-year plan, the attempts at transforming the Soviet economy to produce huge industrial gains, as well as the agricultural sector through collectivization. These provide us with really clear examples of communism in practice. The aim of Stalin to produce this leap toward socialism produced extreme amounts of suffering. There was a kind of uniformity imposed upon the entire, vast Soviet Union. The command economy was in place, and the peasantry came under control of the state via collectivization. And as we saw, any resistance to this was met with extremely harsh measures. Being a group or class that was perceived as standing in the way of this great leap was tantamount to counter-revolutionary treason. So what might happen to those actual members of the Communist Party that were perhaps less than enthused by this direction that Stalin was taking this communist experiment into? Well, naturally, reports and statistics were being provided to the effect of confirming the first 5-year plan as a success. Stalinism was in full swing. But some of the effects, like the human cost of collectivization, some parts of the population and the party would be shaken by this. A lower-ranking party official named Ryutin circulated a kind of critique of collectivization among some party members, and when Stalin found this out, he tried to make capital punishment an available course of action for party members who went against party goals. This change didn't immediately occur, but in 1932 we see Stalin setting the groundwork, perhaps, for what will eventually be widespread purges. In fact, at the end of that year, after a banquet that involved some disparaging remarks and rudeness from Stalin toward his wife, would end with a visible argument between the two after he flicked a cigarette at her, and she was found dead from an apparent suicide the next day. A gunshot wound having been supposedly self-inflicted. Some suggest that she had also been criticizing the 5-year plan and may have even challenged him personally on it as well. So perhaps this is an early purge that Stalin goes about. And if you are willing to purge your wife, well then what hope does the rest of the party have? But it was after the 1934 Party Congress that events transpired to give Stalin what he needed to begin the Great Terror. At these party congresses, which happened every 4 or 5 years, again, these bring everyone together, I guess the equivalent of a kind of political caucus you might see in modern politics. Anyway, at the 1934 Congress, there was an attempt, I guess in a vaguely passive-aggressive kind of way, by some members of the Congress, estimates vary, but perhaps more than 10% of the roughly 1,200 members in attendance, well, this small percentage tried to let Stalin know that some people were doubting his credibility. Many of them would have remembered what had happened to Stalin's wife, or to Ryutin, not that long ago, so voicing their displeasure was not going to be done with a hands-up kind of approach. This was done via a kind of ballot system, where those that were trying to voice their displeasure just, they struck off Stalin's name from this sheet and handed it back. And no one was really able to identify who had actually done this. There's just a big stack of papers, and some number of them have Stalin's name ticked off. Well, Stalin kind of gets the impression that it could have been anyone at the party congress. And for him, this is like knowing there are some rotten apples in the cart, and he can't exactly tell which ones are which. And if there was ever a historical figure that would have a tendency to throw out the entire apple cart, I believe Joseph Stalin would be that person. He does have some suspicions, however, and most of these become focused on the party secretary of Leningrad, Sergei Kirov. He was seen by some as a potentially better leader than Stalin, someone a little bit softer, less fanatical. Kirov, who became aware of these rumors that may have been circulating, like a couple of people saying, hey, we think you'd be a lot better, and so does this guy. Well, naturally he realizes that if some people are talking, well, Stalin would probably have heard this too. And Stalin is not someone that you want to have being concerned about your intentions. Kirov comes to Stalin, essentially apologizing even for these rumors to exist. You're coming up, knock, knock, hey, just, I realize people are saying this, and I hope you know that I don't think anyone could really replace you, comrade, certainly not me. To which Stalin, is said to have sat there and looked at him for a while, and then have replied, thank you, in an extremely menacing manner. In December of 1934, Kirov is assassinated. The details are a little bit fuzzy, but it's an extremely high probability that Stalin was behind this. Kirov is shot and killed by another party member, and Stalin's fingerprints can be discerned in what follows the assassination of Leningrad's former party secretary. Literally the day of the assassination, decrees are quickly passed that stipulate the speedy investigation and execution of sentences that relate to cases of terrorism against the state. They could happen as quickly as 10 days, could be heard without the participation of the accused. The sentence was irrevocable, and a death sentence could be handed out immediately. This is like a big rubber stamp. Boom, you're sentenced. Boom, you're sentenced. Stalin now had the ability to legally enforce the great wave of state terror that was to be instigated and directed many times within his own Communist Party. Two senior party leaders from Leningrad, Zinovlev and Kamenev, they and their associates are immediately blamed for the assassination of Kirov. Stalin saw these two, who had erred against the very initial October insurrection of 1917. So these guys are old school. They've been in the party for a long time, from the start, really. Well, Stalin also has a long memory, and basically saw these guys as having failed a test. These were bad eggs. Even though their supposed indiscretion had happened around about 20 years ago. They are executed in 1936. Maybe around another 40,000 Leningraders are also arrested. The advent of show trials, where prominent party officials confessed their guilt in open court, admitting to accusations of treason or conspiracies to kill Kirov or Stalin himself, or being linked with espionage for foreign governments. These became the top of a kind of pyramid of terror, where massive amounts of arrests of people who were guilty by association with the accused became the subject of police investigations, and confessions would be coerced through violence and torture. Those found guilty would be sent to the Gulag network, or simply taken across the street to a basement and shot. on the 12th of December 1938, Stalin personally approved the execution of 3,167 people. He then went and saw a film. But the Great Terror, although probably not possible without Stalin's influence, it wasn't just him that created it. Local leaders and regional members also played their part in carrying out the terror. Younger party members benefited by jumping up the ranks into positions previously held by veterans. And there were millions of arrests, perhaps 3 or 4 million, and maybe 800,000 or so death sentences handed down. Again, estimates vary, but it is an astonishing amount of state-sponsored murder of one's own citizens. Oh, more than that, party associates. In fact, 2/3 of the party leadership was purged, half of the army high command, and nearly every important communist left over from the 1917 revolution. Those that were sent to the Gulag, the system of labor camps, were faced with inhuman conditions. They were ostensibly there for re-education, but in reality a lot of this was just punitive. The worst of these was known as Kolyma, and in the Stalinist period, perhaps 3 million or so people would die in these camps. In much the same way that the French Revolution has the guillotine, Rwanda, the machete, well, Stalin's Soviet Union has the Gulag. Okay, before we backtrack just slightly and speak about one of the 4 main goals that Lenin originally had in place as the Russian Revolution began, the spread of communism worldwide, I just want to take a moment here and reflect slightly on the Soviet system in relation to communism as an idea, or at least how it was formulated by Marx and Engels. I mean, how much did Lenin and then Stalin change these original formulations? One way to look at this would be in that original Communist Manifesto. As I said earlier and in the previous episode, there are these 10 points toward the end of that document before we get to the workers of the world unite, which kind of gives you an idea of what a communist revolution would do once, I guess, it was in control. We've got things like the abolition of property. That was certainly taken care of by the Soviets. The centralization of money into the hands of the state. Yes, they certainly did that. And they definitely took to the equal liability of all to work and the establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. The command economy is that almost to a T. Now, in the manifesto, they do throw the caveat in there. They say these measures will, of course, be different in different countries. And as we've, spent a lot of time discussing, Russia is the most different of different countries, according to Marx and Engels. They were the least appropriate place to get this set up. But set it up they did. And the results of this, even though the Soviet Union becomes a state, I think were fairly devastating. Millions of people died, despite the best intent that was at play here. Even if you grant these people the idea that they were trying to create a utopia, well, they ended up killing a lot of people. Lenin and his focus on the idea of a proletarian vanguard, a party that could guide the masses toward socialism, well, that system relied on repression and terror from a very early point. Stalin took this further into a realm of totalitarianism. But at every stage, the idea that the ends would justify the means was the underline of any given action. The reason we've outlined some of these policies and the ideas that either supported them or were produced by them is in some part an attempt for me to demystify some of the eventual ideas and policies of the Khmer Rouge. The terror born of purges, the conditions imposed by collectivization, the targeting of groups considered to be incapable of supporting a communist cause. All of this will be on display in Pol Pot's Cambodia. I do sometimes notice a tendency to paint the crimes of the Khmer Rouge as completely unique. And while history never truly repeats itself, I think it's clear to see that there are echoes and ripples throughout time. Now, over the last couple of episodes, I guess we've had two kinds of separate timelines. One following developments in Cambodia into the 1930s, and one looking at the formation of these cold, dry, foreign weather systems, as I've been calling them. They're coming from Europe and the wider world, and we've seen how they've developed up to and around about the start of the Second World War. Well, now we are going to bridge the gap and explore the results of that Bolshevik aim of exporting world communism, following the path of one revolutionary from a village in central Vietnam, the man that would become Ho Chi Minh. At the age of 21, and going by the name of Ba, the young Ho Chi Minh had left the shores of Vietnam to work on a French steamship, the La Touche Travail. By this time, he had received an education at a grammar school in the old royal capital of Hue. He was the son of an official who had resigned in protest against the French domination of his country. The boy that was born Nguyen Tat Tan was exposed to ideas of anti-colonialism from a very early age. He spent more than 2 years aboard the steamship, and he saw much of the world in this time. American cities like Boston and New York, as well as various African ports. There he saw the French colonialism that he knew, but applied in other colonies. The problems for the Vietnamese were shared for these people too. Following this, he left the ship to work in England during the First World War. He was a pastry cook, living a poor and dark life, while working in one of the most fancy kitchens and serving the richest people. Eventually, in 1917, the height of the war, he moved to France and witnessed a different kind of French person to the one that he had experienced when he lived in Vietnam. He saw the average French working man. Historian Jean Lacouture, writing that the young Ho was struck by the similarity between the lot of the exploited inhabitant of a colony and that of a European worker, perhaps broadening the scope of his political views to something different than just a wish to evict a foreign power from your home soil. Eventually, Ho would begin making contact with the French political left, and he became an active socialist, changing his name from Ba to Nguyen Ai Quoc, meaning Nguyen the Patriot. During this time in France, he became a photo retoucher, which I guess back then was the equivalent of a physical Instagram filter, someone that sort of sorted that out for your photos. Anyway, this wasn't exactly a booming business in the fallout of World War I, and he wasn't making much money. He was impoverished, often hungry, usually unemployed, and usually unable to pay rent. But David Halberstam, in his biography of Ho, claims that this was also an exciting time in the young man's life, particularly in this socialist quarter. Imagine hearing stories coming from Moscow about the Bolsheviks seizing power, perhaps thinking that the revolution would spread around the globe. In this world of anticipation, Ho became enmeshed with other revolutionaries, Vietnamese or otherwise. He met with Karl Marx's grandson, and later became the first Vietnamese member of the French Young Socialists. Ho became a fairly prominent member of the left-wing world in Paris, and in 1919 he would cement his reputation as a hero to other sympathetic Vietnamese when he organized a group to address an 8-point petition to the representatives of the great powers that were attending the Versailles Peace Conference. This included demands that the French colonial power grants its subjects in Indochina equal rights with the rulers. And it was largely ignored. You'll sometimes hear this story retold as if Woodrow Wilson didn't get the letter or failed to attend a meeting with Ho, and that this then led the young Vietnamese man to turn away from the West as an avenue away from the French for his people. But it's fairly clear that Ho, by this time, had already considered his politics. He had already become a committed socialist, regardless of some supposed missed connection with the US president. The following year, in 1920, he becomes convinced that Marxism and Leninism and communism can liberate the oppressed people of the world, the Vietnamese naturally being his most personal example. To get an idea of how Nguyen the Patriot viewed this oppression, here is a part of a speech he made to the French socialists in December of that year. Quote, "I come here with deep sadness to speak as a member of the Socialist Party against the imperialists who have committed abhorrent crimes on my native land. You all have known the French imperialists entered Indochina half a century ago. In its selfish interest, it conquered our country with bayonets. Since then, we have not only been oppressed and exploited shamelessly, but also tortured and exploited pitilessly. Prisons outnumber schools and are always overcrowded. Any natives having socialist ideas are arrested and sometimes murdered without trial. We have neither freedom of the press nor freedom of speech. We have no right to live in other countries or travel. The Socialist Party must act realistically to support the oppressed natives." End quote. The French Socialist Party split following this meeting. A schism had formed between those who basically didn't want to go through democratic means to bring about communism, those that looked at this new Soviet example as the way to go. The French Communist Party was formed on the 30th of December, and Ho was one of its founding members. This marks the change in his life between a somewhat radical socialist who was looking to do something about the plight of his people into something resembling more like a professional revolutionary. On the 30th of June 1923, Ho, under the name Chen Vang, which was on the Russian travel document that had been issued to him, arrived in the same city that Lenin had all the way back in 1917, although this time Ho came by ship rather than train. By this time, Ho had become a fairly famous figure in France, well, in a particular group, particularly for those Vietnamese exiles who were angry about French domination and anxious to join a movement that was going to try and do something about it. Ho was the man. When the Russian Revolution began, one of Lenin's big four goals was to export communism worldwide. Part of that goal was setting up the Third International Workingmen's Association. Remember, that was the kind of conference and meeting place that the old socialists had set up back when Marx and Engels were still kicking. There had been a second iteration of it, which had also eventually been disbanded. But this new one, the third version of it, this one was going to stick. It's set up in Moscow, and it's called the Comintern. The reason for Ho's visit in 1923 is that a kind of offshoot of the Comintern was having a conference. Not the International Workingmen's Conference, but the International Peasants' Conference. The Krestintern. That has a bad ring to it, doesn't it? But I guess that's because I'm less couched in Marxist terminology. And if you ain't bourgeoisie or proletariat, I guess you're a peasant. Anyway, the Soviets have this conference at a time of uncertainty. As we spoke about earlier, in the wake of the initial revolution, there was this period of war communism. There was also a kind of expectation that in the rest of Europe, all of the working class, all of the proletariat, would have witnessed the Russian Revolution and followed suit. Well, as we saw, war communism was having to be stepped back from. The new economic policy, the NEP, was being introduced. Lenin had recently had the first of his many strokes, and there was a kind of general wonder about exactly what was going to happen next. On the issue of worldwide revolution, this one was a bit of a pickle. If the proletariat hadn't been able to seize the opportunity and lead their nations into communism, taking their rightful historical position, right? Well, if they didn't do it, who else might? Maybe there was a need to open up the revolutionary doors a little wider. Maybe these vast swathes of colonized peoples could be included in the mix. In a world that was hostile to the Soviet Union, they needed as many allies as they could get. So perhaps tweaking slightly some of this Marxist doctrine about the backwardness of the peasantry would be necessary. And this is easily discerned in the way that the communist manifestos call for workers of the world to unite. Well, perhaps that could just quickly have a couple of adjustments made to it. Yeah, how about peasants and workers of the world unite? That's got a ring to it. Ho would eventually begin working for the Comintern proper, and engage in political activity as well as become a vocal advocate for the organization to help those suffering under imperialism. In January of 1924, as we saw in the intro to this episode, Ho expressed his sadness at the passing of Lenin with that eulogy. A eulogy that not only made Ho look pretty good to his new employers, but also suggests that he thinks that Leninism is not only a path toward worldwide socialism, but also a means of escape for colonialized peoples. Historian Stephen Morris suggests that from this point, and over the next 16 years, before he changed his alias to Ho Chi Minh, Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, was a full-time functionary of the Comintern, working in the USSR, Western Europe, China, Hong Kong, Siam, and Malaysia. In December of 1924, Ho, traveling in Canton, China, will organize a group of exiled Vietnamese into the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth Association, or Tan Nguyen, and begin the underground revolutionary movement. By 1930, this movement will become the Communist Party of Vietnam, and 1 year later, under pressure from the Comintern, this will be rebranded once again as the Indochinese Communist Party. Now, that renaming of the party is actually quite important. Why is it that the Vietnamese Communist Party, comprised of, Vietnamese members, and led by Ho, why did they have to rename it the Indochinese Party? Well, after filing the founding documents with his employers back in Moscow, I guess, kind of like registering a car or business, you've got to fill out the paperwork and submit it to the proper authorities, right? If you want to start a revolutionary movement. Anyway, the Comintern sees the name of the party, and they're like, hey, what's this? Just Vietnam? They argued that, quote, not only does Indochina have a geographic, economic, and political unity, but above all, we have a need for unity of struggle, for a unique direction of all of the Indochinese proletariat opposed to all of the forces of reaction in Indochina, to the policy of division of French imperialism. End quote. What they're saying here is that we need one direction, one movement against French colonialism, rather than independent struggles. So change the name to the Indochinese Communist Party, even though there is not one communist in Laos or Cambodia yet. Ho disagreed with this directive and said that until Cambodia or Laos have their own similar committees, then the name shouldn't be changed to something that included them. However, the Comintern refused, saying that even though there was a social and ethnic difference between the three countries, they were close enough politically and economically to fall under the same umbrella. At a second meeting in Hong Kong in October 1930, the changes that were imposed by the Comintern were made official. Now you might be saying to yourself, Lachlan, this kind of sounds like a pretty small detail that you're harping on about. But this is actually going to have an extremely large influence in this story as it goes on, in a variety of ways. First of all, by the time we see communist pamphlets being found in Cambodian towns like Battambang or in a rubber plantation in Kampot, these activities will be functions of the Indochinese Communist Party, but largely carried out by the Vietnamese. The effort to liberate Vietnam from French colonialism will necessitate that some kind of independence movements are also maintained in the rest of Indochina. Leninism. This idea that history can be pushed and a proletarian vanguard can pull a nation into communism. Well, if we transplant that to Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and his party will also be required to pull Cambodia and Laos along with them. The second reason this is important is because even though, when the party is first announced, it has a very small membership, it will eventually be a major force when decolonization begins after World War II. And if this particular movement is going to be successful, well, it's also going to be heavily influenced by Moscow, right? Well, then it is naturally going to fall on that side of the coming Cold War. And what would happen if the French were vanquished? Would another Soviet republic, another federation loyal to the Soviet Union, be set up across Indochina? Lenin had said in 1920 that these federations were a transitional form to the global communist vision, and subsequent Comintern literature stated that prior to the attainment of the utopian dream, the dictatorship of the world proletariat, the future communist bloc was to be a network combining individual nation-states and federated unions all across the world. So we're talking about Indochina being a Soviet federation. But what if another of the world's eventual great communist powers, China, did not wish for there to be a Soviet federation just sitting there at its southern border? The interplay of all of these forces is going to be extremely interesting over the next 60 or 70 years. But it's here, in the mid-1920s, where we witness the first time that the foreign cold winds, the Marxist, Leninist weather patterns, slowly beginning to merge with those warm, moist pressure systems in Indochina. And here, it might just produce a light breeze, perhaps a little rain. But very soon, that is going to turn into huge, dark clouds, thunder and lightning. If Vietnam is to be the vanguard of Indochinese communism, then how will that merge with the kinds of rhetoric that we have come to associate with Cambodians and their attitude toward their eastern neighbour? This traditional view that the Vietnamese are this cunning race and swallowers of Khmer soil. Nayan Chanda, author of Brother Enemy, The War After the War, writes about the relationship between the two peoples extensively, and from his experience living in the region for many years, explaining the Cambodian feelings of antipathy and concern about the Vietnamese, echoing the "don't spill the master's tea" story, but then too explaining the slightly patronizing view that the Vietnamese can take of Cambodians as well. Quote, "In many conversations with official and non-official Vietnamese, their feelings of superiority over the Khmers in political education, organization, and leadership ability can be clearly sensed. When charitable, the Vietnamese tend to view the Khmers as children who need guidance." Now, he also goes on to reflect on this kind of thing as the intangible, abstract nature of folk memory and traditional antipathy, and saying that this renders it useless as scientific tools for social or historical analysis, but says that these feelings are so palpable to anyone who has spent any time there that it is impossible to ignore them in understanding recent events. End quote. What he succinctly puts there is what we've spent a few episodes detailing: the Vietnamese march to the south, the taking of Cambodian territory around the Mekong Delta, the attempts to civilize the country under Emperor Minh Mang. And while the French colonial system will interrupt that historical flow, it will not go on forever. The Khmer and the Vietnamese will unite under the flag of communism, but this dynamic between the hereditary enemies will not go away. The Khmer communist movement will be born out of the Vietnamese one, and this split on the family tree of communist parties, coming from the Soviet Union and then the French Communist Party and then the Indochinese, well, that will lead to more war. We've charted the course of communism from the context in which it was born, through to the changes that led to it being the foundational principle of the entire Soviet Union, and then how this message of revolution was taken to the parts of the world where different classes of people were oppressed, but looking for some way out from under the boot of European imperialism. Independence is coming to Vietnam and Cambodia, and all of Indochina, and the forces of nationalism and communism will intertwine and clash in a variety of ways. The historical hurricane is beginning to take shape.